Shalom Nikulam. Hello, everybody. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow here at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center in Jerusalem. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to another of our weekly English Zoom programs where I talk to a guest speaker about an issue pertinent to the Middle East, Israeli politics, the Jewish world, or something connected to one of those issues. I think we have, as usual, an international crowd, people here from watching and listening from here in Israel, from the United States and Canada, the UK and elsewhere. So welcome wherever you are. For those of you who are new to this, I'll just say how it's going to work. I'm going to speak to our guests for about 30, 40 minutes and then turn it over to you to ask questions. And you can ask those questions by writing them in the chat at the bottom of your screen. You can write those at any time, but you can, if questions arise as my conversation with our guest is going on, then you can always write the questions in so you don't forget, and I promise I will get to them. Okay, so we've in recent weeks we've been talking a lot about international issues. We've been talking about Russia and Ukraine. Last week we had a fantastic conversation about a visit of a Jewish Arab delegation to Poland for March of the Living. All of our previous conversations are on our YouTube channel, so if you missed those, then go and check them out. But what I wanted to do today was to talk about developments in Israel's diplomatic efforts in recent weeks, because Israel, for a small country, punches above its weight diplomatically, and it seems to have been busier than usual in recent months. And I wanted to invite someone who actually writes about these things for a living. So I'm very happy to have with me, virtually at least, Lazar Berman, who is both the diplomatic affairs correspondent and the Christian affairs correspondent for the Times of Israel. He spent 5 years as head of joint learning at the Dado Center, which is the IDF General Staff's think tank. He was also the Foreign and Defense Policy Research Manager at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. In his active military service in the IDF, Lazar Berman commanded a mortar platoon and a Bedouin infantry platoon. He's now a reserve captain in the 89th Commando Brigade. He has an MA in military operations from Georgetown University's Security Studies program, where he wrote his thesis on IDF innovation. And he's currently pursuing a PhD in war studies at King's College in London. He also taught, and this is particularly interesting, I think, he also taught at Salahuddin University in Erbil in Iraqi Kurdistan and studied the Kurdish language. But this conversation will be in English. At least because I have no Kurdish. So, Lazar Berman, welcome to the Begin Center Zoom.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, all the guests. I see some friends here. I see some new faces. So I look forward to the next hour that I'm going to spend with you.
Great. So, so let's get right into it. So one of the sort of highest profile sort of diplomatic stories of late is this seeming rapprochement with Turkey, right? That for several years, Israel has had a very bad relationship with President Erdogan's Turkey. Many of us will remember the Mavi Marmara incident. Some of us will remember the footage of Erdogan storming off the stage when at a Davos Summit with Shimon Peres. And then in recent weeks, we've had President Herzog visiting Turkey. And then I think, was it this week or last week, the foreign minister of Turkey was here in Israel. Can you give us some background to this? Why is this happening? Is this pushed more by Turkey, more by Israel? And where is it likely to lead?
Sure. So yeah, this is one of the more fascinating developments. And I think it's something that Israel itself and observers expected to happen. We all know that Israel has been somewhat or extremely cautious about upsetting Turkey in any sort of way that would cause damage for decades. So if we take the example of the Armenian genocide, Israel has been quite vocally silent on recognizing that. And I think that, quite obviously is a recognition that at some point they were going to get back into a working relationship with Turkey, and that's in Israel's interest, despite all the problems. And I think talking to officials, everyone knows that Erdogan and his circle are not going to be Zionists. They're not going to be friends of Israel in terms of, when it comes to Jerusalem, when it comes to Palestinians, they're going to reserve the right to criticize us. But it looks like there's no question that Turkey, even more than Israel, is eager to get back into reasonable working relationship. And I think the important point here is that it's not just Israel. This is a decision by Turkey, I would say, ever since it was clear that Biden was going to be the next president. If you look back at the Biden-Erdogan relationship, it's personal, it's nasty, it's immature. Over the past decade, there's been, almost threats to fight from Erdogan, an Erdogan spokesman. They just don't like each other. And President Trump gave Erdogan, quite a wide berth to do what he would in Syria. Really upset some people. It was, a criticism that this is Trump's approach to, these kind of strong men within countries that have some sort of democratic system. But I think Erdogan kind of, was able to see which way the winds were blowing once Biden was coming in. Biden was very explicit that he was going to pressure countries, even American allies, on things like human rights. I think also Turkey realized, and Erdogan realized, that the confidence it felt in the wake of the Arab Spring was a mistake. So Turkey positioned itself with Qatar and with the Muslim Brotherhood as the head of the political Islam camp, and thought that that was the future of the Middle East, and that old regimes like in Egypt especially were gone forever, and that the new Middle East, Turkey would be at the front of. Well, there was a counter-revolution in Egypt, as we know. Countries that are very uncomfortable with the Muslim Brotherhood and with political Islam, especially the UAE, banded together against Turkey. In Libya, you almost had a fighting war between Egypt and Turkey, and that really became pretty tense. And then, of course, the relationship with Greece really upset the EU. France became a major player, has deployed significant military assets, especially naval assets, to the region. So Turkey understood that this is only isolating it, and it needs to start reaching out and building relations to these countries that have become rivals. We had actual architecture like the East Med Gas Forum. We don't know what practical results will come of it, but it's certainly an alliance. It's an alliance of Israel. It has UAE, Egypt, Italy has a place to be there, Cyprus and Greece, of course, and that is quite clearly a response to Turkish aggressive moves. So I think Turkey understood that it needs to start speaking to the UAE, to the Saudis, to Egypt, to Greece until last week that blew up again, but also to France. You see much real desire to improve relations with Macron, and Israel is a part of that. It is an important part of that. I think Israel is quite cautious. Israel understands that it's playing from a position of power here, and its main demand is Hamas. Israel has to be confident that even if Hamas officials are still in Turkey, they're not able to plan attacks. Turkish officials have told me that that's not going on, that there's currently a misunderstanding between the two sides. But if we look at Çavuşoğlu's visit last week with Lapid, in their public statements, neither side mentioned Hamas. So it seems like that is, still needs to be worked on. Neither side in the public statements mentioned the return of the ambassadors. So in 2018, Eitan Naeh, who's a wonderful diplomat, is really, when you think of what a diplomat should be, it's that type of person. He was humiliated by the Turks. They told the press to go to the airport as they booted him out and subjected him to a humiliating search, the kind, that you and me and all the regular folks go through at the airport. But to invite Turkish media there was obviously intentional, and Israel responded in kind. So since 2018, there has not been full diplomatic relations, and that did not come up in the public statements last week either. Just a final point on that. What did come up from the Turkish side is, they stressed their commitment to the Palestinians, their sensitivities over Jerusalem. And interestingly, back home, it was sold as a visit to the Palestinians with Israel at the end. So he landed, I believe it was on a Tuesday, went right to Ramallah, and then day 2, he went to Yad Vashem and met with Lapid. So if you look at, it was the Daily Sabah, which is a regime affiliated, if not controlled, newspaper in Turkey. Obviously, the line's pretty pretty blurry, but it said, Çavuşoğlu visits Palestine. And then you read down a little bit and you see about the Israel visit. So that makes it easier to sell to his domestic audience. There is an election coming up in 2023 where it's not at all certain that Erdogan will even hold parliament. So he has to be very careful about some of these domestic, how these things play on the domestic front.
Fascinating. So Erdogan, I mean, as you said, he's not going to turn to a Zionist overnight. I mean, ideologically, he's not well disposed towards Israel and Zionism, given his background. So I just want to say to our viewers and listeners, we're going to be going over a whole bunch of topics here. So as things come up to you, please do write them in the chat, and I'll get to them. So let's move on from Turkey to sort of across the Middle East, if you like, to the Gulf states and the Abraham Accords. So there was the Negev Summit a few weeks ago, where Israel was represented along with the United States and Bahrain, the UAE, and Egypt, I think. Sorry?
In Morocco.
And Morocco, right? Sorry, yes, of course, and Morocco. And this was seen as although it was, it was kind of a continuation of what had gone on with the signing of the Abraham Accords, but it was really a new thing. And also the fact that Egypt were there as well, sort of the bringing together of the old sort of countries that Israel had long been at peace with into this new process with the Gulf states and Morocco. And I read recently that there's going to be a follow-up, I think, in Bahrain, if that's already been, I don't know if that's already been confirmed. But what was the significance of that? Both the holding of it, but also anything that came out of it, because there was talk afterwards about things that the United States did or didn't say in that summit, and what we maybe could have sort of guessed or worked out from the diplomatic language from both the United States on the one hand and Israel and the Arab states on the other.
Sure. So yeah, Negev Summit was late March. That came about very quickly. And I think if we look at the two major diplomatic initiatives that this two-headed government has pushed, so you had Bennett pushing the mediation between Ukraine and Russia, always a long shot, and went nowhere, and I think did some damage to himself in Washington. Lapid had this great success, right? It was really a Lapid pulled it together. He had help from Blinken. He told me that it was, all these leaders are WhatsApping each other. So it was a couple of days of WhatsApp, and they were able to get everyone there. The big surprise who was there was Egypt's Sama Shukri. So Egypt's, I don't want to say pro-Israel, but the part of the Egyptian establishment that is more amenable to good times with Israel is the intelligence/security establishment. Shukri is heading the foreign ministry, which is a very pro-Palestinian body. And you could tell if you look at the pictures, it's almost funny. That's why I smile as I talk about it. He comes off the airplane in the Nevatim Air Base. He didn't have a mask. When he's meeting Lapid, he had a mask over his face. If you look at all the pictures, all the other ministers are smiling. And you see Shukri there, like, I don't know, like he's indigestion or something. He refused to smile. He just had this sourpuss face on the whole time. And I think obviously that that was intentional. He didn't seem too happy to be there. Who wasn't there though? Jordan was not there. Jordan's an interesting case. It seemed the Jordan relationship with Netanyahu obviously broke down. And if you remember, they blocked him from flying, and Israel seemed to block the crown prince from coming into Israel. This government, especially Lapid, has been eager to restore those ties, and the U.S. certainly wants to see that happen. It doesn't need any tension between two of its closest allies in the region. But that seems to be crumbling again in many ways, especially over the tensions over Ramadan in Jerusalem. I think quite rightly, Jordan was seen as not only not helpful, but as a damaging player. We can go into that in questions if you want, why Abdullah would seek to, not necessarily make the tensions worse, but keep them in the news and keep them going. So that hasn't been too helpful. He hasn't been too helpful there. Also, let's not forget, Jordan, to some extent Egypt, but Egypt's better position. Jordan feels kind of left behind by the Abraham Accords. they say, okay, we have to pay this big price domestically and in the Arab world, and we were willing in the 90s to recognize Israel, but we have not seen this, this celebration. We haven't seen major business deals. Obviously, a lot of it's on the Jordan side, but then it sees all of this excitement and the U.S. getting so involved, and it feels somewhat less left behind. So I think that's part of what's going on there as well, besides the domestic side of things. In terms of the Gulf states, we have to look at them each separately. I mean, I think people kind of say Bahrain and UAE went in together. Yes, sort of. UAE had to go first, but we haven't seen a ton of UAE, Bahrain, Israel things. It's kind of broken off into either the big multilateral or bilateral relationships. Bahrain sees Iran as the number one enemy and the Saudis as their shield, right? They're connected to the Saudis in every which way. They see the Iranians as trying to stir up the Shiites in their kingdom and to overthrow it. And they have a very significant U.S. naval presence. The naval fleet, the Sixth Fleet, is right there. So they were pushing at the Negev Summit for a more formalized security architecture. That was the word that kept coming up. But there were whispers about a Middle Eastern NATO. Obviously, NATO would mean local countries with with guarantees of U.S. military power, and that is very much what Bahrain would want. The UAE is different, and I think we have to just take a step back, look at UAE, how the UAE sees the world. The UAE sees the world as a very networked type of place. If anyone wants to read more on this, Joshua Krasna at the Dado Center was in the region. He's been publishing some of his thoughts. He's done some wonderful work on that as well, so you can look that up. But they don't see any problem, developing close relationships with Russia, China, and the U.S. Where the U.S., especially recently with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, has been pushing the UAE to join in on things like sanctions and get on the U.S. side. And the UAE really doesn't want to do it. The UAE has built itself to be part of a world where the U.S. guarantees this openness, this open flow of money and finances. And then when you see the U.S. kind of without any sort of normal process, freezing assets and taking property from Russians, as much as we might dislike what the Russians are doing, it's not something that the UAE is comfortable with, because that's changing the rules of the game for the way they've built themselves. And I think they're very uncomfortable with that. And they know, hey, it could happen to us sometime. At some point, the U.S. gets upset with us with our human rights records. All of a sudden we have assets all over the place. They're going to get frozen. I don't think it wants to see that. The UAE, like Turkey, also had a very adventurous foreign policy. So they were in Yemen, they were in Libya, and I think they realized that also has been the time has come to stop that and to focus more on economic development. They are very significantly, really pushing very hard to diversify their economy away from fossil fuels and really become a financial center and a high-tech hub. And that is something the Saudis are doing as well. So you see little hints of Saudi UAE rivalry there in terms of attracting headquarters of global corporations. So that's the way the UAE sees the world. How do they see the Abraham Accords? Listen, they see the Iranians as certainly a threat, but it's not their main threat. There's always been an open channel between, especially Dubai and the Iranians, especially a trade relationship. There's plenty of Iranians there. So it's not the same. They've always maintained an open channel, and it's been a useful back channel for the West to Iran. Their main rival is this Turkish, Qatar, Muslim Brotherhood, political Islam thing. So that's why you see them being really leading on the anti-Turkey efforts in recent years. But again, senior leaders from the UAE and from Turkey have been meeting. So both sides are interested in patching that up. What does the UAE want from Israel? Certainly, military support from the United States. I think they would want the United States to be much more aggressive in pursuing Iranian ally proxies, who have been firing into Saudi Arabia, and now, as we can see, into the UAEs and attacking shipping. And I think they're disappointed by the strength of the American response, both under Trump and certainly under Biden as well. I think they were spooked by the Afghanistan withdrawal and what that says about American commitment to the region. So I think there's this balancing going on where countries realize that local countries need to create their own infrastructure, their own security architecture. Obviously, they want as much American involvement as possible, but absent that, they have to be able to talk to the Iranians, and they have to be able to work, in terms of military side with the Saudis, with the Israelis, with the Egyptians, and others.
Okay, and so the US was there, represented by Secretary of State Antony Blinken.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Now, there was this sort of early on in the Biden administration, there was seemed to be this incredible reluctance to give any kind of even mention, but certainly credit to the Abraham Accords because it was a Trump initiative. Yep. And I think that seems to have changed a little bit. Is that now, was Blinken's appearance there and things he said, were they, from Israel's point of view, were they basically very positive? Were there any concerns about things he said, maybe differences of opinion over Iran?
I think what concerned Israel was the tensions between the United States and the UAE and the United States and the Saudis. Mostly around the freeing up and the production of more oil, because obviously the Biden administration is not especially popular right now. It's dealing with this inflation, has a midterm coming up, and would like to see oil prices, gas prices come down. Yeah. Not to mention obviously the war in Ukraine, and there's reports that the Saudis and the Emiratis were not even taking the Biden administration's calls or Biden's calls themselves. That's not good. Israel certainly does not want to see those type of tensions. It has nothing to gain from it. And some of those issues were discussed quite stridently at the Negev Summit in terms of what Israeli officials told me. Things were not solved, but I think tensions were reduced somewhat. So I think that was the big worry for Israel. You point out quite rightly that at the beginning of the Biden administration, they certainly would not even say the Abraham Accords. They denied that they weren't saying it, but it was obvious to everyone. And they seem to certainly have gotten over that. What exactly caused it? Could have been internal criticism. It could have been, some of the domestic initiatives really not going anywhere. So leaning into some foreign policy initiatives and trying to get some successes there. And also realizing that you can't pull out of the Middle East, right? You see Biden getting pulled back into the Middle East from Iraq, Afghanistan, firing of these rockets from Yemen and shipping. So I think he understands this point. Leaving the Middle East is a pipe dream as much as he'd like to. So he might as well be active as possible. And I think Blinken really does believe in this. So you see him being very involved. There was that four-way call between the Indian foreign minister, UAE's foreign minister, Lapid and Blinken, and then the Negev Summit, he was an active and eager participant in. Like you said, there will be a follow-up. They established, I believe, 6 working groups. So there's a working group in Bahrain. If you check the Times of Israel tonight at about midnight, you'll have another little piece about another development with Israel and Bahrain. So look for it then. Those of you in the United States will still be up. I can't talk about it until then, but so there are things going on for sure in the Bahrain-Israel relationship. I would just add that, Bahrain, I think they're afraid of getting left behind because they're not the UAE. They don't have that big, splashy, shiny Dubai, Abu Dhabi thing. They don't have the emotional tie that Israelis have to Morocco, right? That's always been there. And I think that they're afraid of being left behind. I don't think the Abraham Accords are especially popular in the kingdom either. Right. They
also have this majority Shia population, which is I think they have a more restive population than say the UAE has, for sure.
Right. And I don't have a recollection of any senior Bahraini officials trying to sell this to their own people. So it seems to be an initiative at the top, from public servants and from the royal family, which is somewhat worrying. I think things are moving along nicely, but we have to understand it's not all it's not all rainbows and unicorns or whatever the phrase is. There are things to be concerned about, and we should not assume that every Emirati or Bahraini approves of these things.
Right. Okay. So you've mentioned a couple of times in passing the Russian invasion of Ukraine, just because it's so all-encompassing. It's affecting pretty much everywhere and everything that's happening in the world right now. And it's can you tell us something about, because I know it's something you've written about quite extensively in the last sort of couple of months. You mentioned sort of Bennett's not very successful attempt to negotiate or to offer himself as a negotiator, a mediator, I should say. where do you think Israel is now in terms of its where it kind of stands on the response to the crisis? You know, initially it wanted to sort of be relatively neutral, and in recent weeks it seems to have come down much harder on Russia, albeit not as hard as America would like it to. Where is Israel on this now, in your view?
So yeah, I think you're right that there has been, you know, a little bit of a shift away from Russia and toward Ukraine in terms of providing some civilian defensive equipment. Yeah. You had the health minister, Nitzan Horowitz, who visited the field hospital in Ukraine. There he, by name, accused Russia of war crimes. Lapid has been leading the condemnation of Russia, whereas Bennett has been playing the good cop in Russian eyes. But I don't think there's been a fundamental change. You know, we're certainly not going to see Israel start sending real weaponry to Ukraine. You know, and I think it's unfair to say that Israel is somewhat different than other countries. Every country is looking out for its own interests. So even European countries, right? So Germany, after it shut down its nuclear plants, is so dependent on Russian gas that has shaped the way it responds to the war. If you want to look at Hungary, you know, other countries, Bulgaria, other countries in Central Eastern Europe, every country has their own interest here. And then you look at the countries that are joining the sanctions. It's not, you know, it's not China, it's not India, it's not the Gulf states. So I don't see why Israel should be any different. You know, it has been awkward because, you know, it was a time when Israel was trying to enlist as much support from the West on its positions on the Iran nuclear deal, and it seemed to be, you know, running counter to the West. But I don't think that has done too much damage. But there were some whispers to me on Capitol Hill from staffers who said that there is some frustration by Israel's friends, especially around this mediation thing. You know, there was a feeling, I think among some, certainly not everyone, that Bennett was seen as carrying Putin's water and carrying his messages around and kind of, you know, being a little bit too close to him. But yeah, you know, I think the Ukrainians keep saying, you know, that they're happy to talk anywhere under certain conditions, even Jerusalem. But the mediation did go to Turkey, not to Israel, and you know, so that has to be seen as a net loss for Bennett.
And there are implications, are there not, for energy policy as a result of, I mean, everywhere, but how does it affect Israel?
Yeah, so I need to find time to write about this, but if you remember, our energy minister, she was on the trip to Glasgow with Bennett. I was there too for COP26. That was in, I believe, November. Remember, it was cold in Scotland, so it could have been, you know, any.
She famously didn't get in at one point because she's in a wheelchair and there was no disabled access. It was a big scandal.
Yeah, she missed the first day. It was an absolute mess. The whole conference was somewhat of a mess, but she came back from that, and then she said that Israel would not be granting new tenders for future gas exploration for a year to give space for renewable energy to be advanced. It was shocking to me. It didn't make that much waves, but you can pursue both at the same time. These natural gas finds are one of Israel's greatest economic, diplomatic achievements, you know, whatever you want to call it, miracles in recent years. To start looking like a place that's not a safe place for investors, I think is absolutely not serious policy. And lo and behold, in the past week, she says, "Oh, guess what? We will be offering those tenders," and as if no one's going to pay attention. So I think reality, you know, kind of, she woke up to reality, and some other Israeli policymakers as well, that we're not going to get off of fossil fuels. Europe, I think, came to this as well. So countries that either have other sources, or countries like France, which have invested deeply in nuclear, are less susceptible to Russian power. And it certainly was a Russian asset. They felt like they could turn off the lights on Europe because they're dependent on Russian natural gas. The US could certainly step up here, but obviously the Biden administration would rather have OPEC countries produce than have America produce. But I think Israel needs to understand that it has a role to play in Europe's moving away from Russian natural gas. The question is, where will Russian natural gas go, right? So the US has pulled its support from the EastMed pipeline that was supposed to go Cyprus, Greece, Italy, and beyond. But Israeli officials and officials. Yuval Steinitz earlier this week, who was the past energy minister, said, we still see this as the solution, and so do many other Cypriots and Greeks. Another option is to Egypt's liquid natural gas plants, and then from there to Europe. And Turkey obviously would like Israel to build a pipeline to Turkey and to turn Turkey into the pipeline for Europe. Obviously, Israel's not going to jump into an energy partnership, which is a long-term thing, right? Natural gas infrastructure takes a while to build and is not something that you move around quickly. Israel's not going to do that until they're very certain about the stability of the Turkey relationship.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. So there's one more topic I want to raise. Before I do, I want to encourage people to write questions into the chat so that I can put your questions to Lazar. Okay, so we're extra fortunate to have Lazar with us today because he actually just got off a plane earlier today. He'd been in France in Paris at an event held at the Israeli embassy in France on Israel-Africa relations, or Israel's presence or return to Africa. What can you tell us about this conference? What was it about? How significant is it in terms of sort of real policy?
Sure. So there's no question that Israel wants the world to know that Israel is back in Africa. So just a short history: in the 50s, but mostly really in the 60s, until the Six-Day War, Israel had wonderful relations across the African continent, especially in agriculture. And that was something that Israeli expertise was, in terms of desert agriculture and such, was very relevant for African countries. There was a kinship seen as countries that had thrown off colonial rule and were building themselves. That came apart after 67, especially 73, where the Arab nations, allied themselves with a non-aligned movement. I guess you can't align yourselves with a non-aligned movement, and started cutting off diplomatic relations. That turned around basically with the Oslo Accord process, and Netanyahu really invested heavily in that. So he had a famous tour in 2017 where he went around and was able to really gain traction. Now, there's plenty of African countries who are interested in a lot of what Israel has to offer. Obviously, the security side. There's multiple terror threats in Africa. You have the Al-Shabaab network in the Horn of Africa. You have ISIS, Boko Haram. The Sahel is a place where the French have been fighting. And so I think there's a lot of desire for Israeli expertise and even presence in some ways. Countries like Kenya. Obviously, the Israeli desire is there as well. If you look at the Horn of Africa, you just look on a map, that's where Israeli shipping to markets like the Gulf, India, and the Far East go through. So when you have pirates, terrorists, Iranian proxies, that's not a good thing for Israel. It really is Israel's backdoor. So there's that interest. But there's also the business side. Israel as a tech startup hub. There's a wonderful tech scene across Africa, and Israeli Foreign Ministry, I think it's the Foreign Ministry, but Israel as a government has set up different types of accelerators in Nigeria and other countries. And obviously the things like agricultural technology, water tech, water and food security is very relevant there as well. You have seen some traction as well. Israel has an ambassador to Chad for the first time in 50 years. He's not in Chad, he's in Senegal. I spoke to him in Paris, but he covers 6 countries. So, and then obviously the Abraham Accords countries. There's 9 countries in Africa which do not recognize Israel. Some of those are Arab countries like Algeria, Tunisia, Libya. Yeah, but then you also have other countries in sub-Saharan Africa as well. Israel became an observer in 2021 to the African Union. There were attempts by South Africa, Algeria, and another country I cannot recall right now, I think Niger, to get that revoked. But in the assembly, they were able to table it for a year and create a commission to talk about it. So Israel is still an observer in the African Union, which is an important asset to Israel. Let's not forget, Israel is one of only 2 countries in the world that share a land border with Africa. So you have Spain has some cities in North Africa, and then Israel has. So it's very relevant for Israel. Just a word about this conference. You might say, why are they doing it in Paris? Paris is a important center for anyone that cares about Africa. You have plenty of media outlets, both French and African, that are based in Paris. Obviously, the Francophone world is very relevant to West Africa. So this was a place for Israeli diplomats, Israeli companies to present to those media outlets what it's trying to do diplomatically in the business sense. And it was very interesting. You had, I believe it was Egypt's ambassador to France was there, and their person at their embassy who's responsible for Africa relations. I believe it was the number 2 in the Moroccan embassy was there. Somaliland's foreign minister was there. Somaliland is an autonomous part of Somalia that it's not recognized as a country, but it runs its own affairs pretty well. Senegal's ambassador to France spoke there. It's a country we had problems with in recent years, but we fixed those up as well. So I think it was an important event, and it had some real interest amongst African nations and people that care about Africa.
Let me just ask quickly, was South Africa present there?
Nope.
Right. Yeah.
Not surprising.
No, right. I mean, I asked the question partly because they're sort of, famously or infamously anti-Israel, but also because, they're an English-speaking country with a Jewish population, they're somewhat uniquely in Africa in that sense. And we often have South African participants on these calls. So I did want to at least raise that. Okay, we have a couple of questions to start us off with. So Jonathan Forstott asks, and I guess this is a reference more than anything to the introduction I gave you, in which I mentioned that you'd spent time in Erbil in Iraqi Kurdistan, and that you speak some Kurdish. And the question is, do you believe there is any possibility there will be an independent Kurdish state in the foreseeable future? And should Israel support such a state, or maybe support the establishment of such a state?
Yeah, wonderful question. So there was that referendum in, I believe, 2018. I think it was September 2018, if I'm not mistaken, where the Kurdish regional government, which is in northern Iraq, recognized by the Iraqi constitution, unilaterally took a referendum of Kurds whether they want to have their own state, passed 99%, something like that. Israel was the only country that supported it. So you had Netanyahu, Lieberman, Ayelet Shaked became oddly very vocal on this.
Yeah, I remember.
I don't know if that was helpful to the Kurds or not. There's many Kurds who appreciated that, but obviously, it created problems for them. Do I think? And that after they passed it, then all the countries around who don't want to see that happen, Turkey, Iran, Iraq, took certain measures, closed Kurdish skies, moved in, took more territory. There's all sorts of punishment. So I don't think anyone really wants it to happen, is the problem. Turkey certainly doesn't because of the PKK problem. By the way, Turkey's relations with the Iraqi Kurdish regional government are wonderful, as long as they don't try to start their own state. The KRG and the PKK are rival Kurdish centers of power. Baghdad obviously wants to maintain a unified country, and Kurdistan has significant oil resources. Iran also has its problem with the Kurdish minority and doesn't want to see a pro-Western, pro-Israeli state, another one on its border. So the U.S. is, Biden back, I don't even remember what it was, I think 20 years ago, said that Iraq should be split into 3, a Shia, a Sunni, and a Kurdish state. But, American policy is, you broke it, you fix it, now you're responsible for it, I guess. So, America basically wrote the Iraqi constitution, which is very much committed to a unified Iraq. So do I think it'll happen in the future? I just don't see how it happens. The Kurds are too divided amongst themselves. They really have not figured out how to leverage any power they might have to make it happen. And there's not much Israel can do to make that happen. Although, Israel could decide that this is in its interest, and I think it would be, and start being more vocal in Washington, but I don't think it has done that since 2018.
Okay. And maybe just a follow-up of mine on that is, given your own experiences there, I remember I've read from other people that have traveled around both in Iraqi Kurdistan and also the Kurdish Syrian Kurdish region, that the Kurds are by and large friendly, or at least not hostile to Israel or Jews. Was that also your experience?
Yeah, I mean, when I was in Iraqi Kurdistan, I kept my Jewish identity as quiet as I could, because there's plenty of Iranians walking around there looking for people like me and Americans. And then you have, Iraqi Arabs from the south who are there as well, who have different thoughts on that. Kurds in general, yeah, I mean, there's some Islamists that, okay, but that's really, it's a small percentage. Kurds in general, they don't have a history of anti-Semitism. They really don't. They have, if they're prejudiced against someone, it's against Arabs. You really see that. So yeah, against Jews, I would go with Kurdish friends to neighborhoods that are still called the Jewish neighborhood, and we would ask, old people, where was this, where was that, and they were happy to show us. There wasn't any problem there at all. In terms of Israel, yeah, I think Israel is certainly seen as an example of a non-Arab people in the Middle East that was able to carve out its own country. And I think there are plenty of relevant lessons there for the Kurds. Whether they're going to learn them or not, who knows? And then there's also the actual history. So in the 60s and 70s, Israel supported the Kurdish rebellions under Barzani against the Iraqis. The idea was to bleed the Iraqi army as much as possible and keep the Iraqis from sending forces in Arab-Israeli wars. There were some successes in that. The Kurds were able to demolish serious Iraqi formations under Israeli guidance. There was Israeli presence there, but they were not able to keep the Iraqis from deploying. So in 73, the best parts of the Iraqi army, made it to Syria. And some say they even halted the Israeli advance on the Golan Heights. So ultimately they were unable to, but that history is remembered. I would just add one thing on the Syrian side. The PKK they're committed Marxists. They really study this stuff. They're serious about it. So serious, in fact, that they fought alongside the PLO in the First Lebanon War 40 years ago. I believe the number is that we killed 11 PKK fighters. I don't know why I know that, but that's the number that stands out. So there's that history, they know it, but if you look at Itai Engel's videos, what he did there, they talk about it. They feel somewhat betrayed by Israel that we helped Turkey and gave them drones to fight against them, but it doesn't seem that hostility runs deep. It's more of a sense of disappointment and betrayal.
Okay. So staying in that region, or that country, or Iraq. So there's this recent, this is a question from Jacqueline. She asks about the recent story in the news that Iraq is passing this law, or has passed, or is planning to pass a law in which anyone with relations with any kind of relations or contacts with Israelis will be killed, will be executed. Is that a serious policy? Is that going to happen?
I can't imagine that anyone would actually get killed, but it's certainly not a good development. If you remember, when was it? I don't even remember when it was. A few months ago, there was a conference in Erbil where Iraqis came out publicly at a hotel and they called for, not only Kurds, also Arabs, called for relations with Israel. And then there was a backlash. Some people said they were fooled into saying it. Obviously, they weren't. Some people had to escape the country. The KRG, which obviously let that happen in its territory, started to come out against it as well. So I think there was a lot of pushback against that. Israel's response to this law was, attacking the law itself, which I think is not the way they should go. I think Israel should be pushing, and other countries as well should be pushing for, the democratic side of it, saying, okay, Iraq is supposed to be somewhat of a democracy. It has a democratic type constitution. An Iraqi that wants to say good things about Israel should be allowed to. If Iraqi wants to say bad things about Israel, should be allowed to. I think that kind of message from Israel would be much more resonant and would, against Iraqis of all types, because I think many people, it's a real multi-ethnic, multi-confessional place. And I think that's the message. So I think it's worrying that, freedom of expression about, just saying good things about Israel is so drastically, it could be so drastically punished. On the plus side of Iraq, though, there's been the Abraham Accords are not the only alliance or axis that is being created. You see there's Jordan, Egypt, Iraq, maybe UAE alliance as well, that they've had a series of meetings. And that seems to be an attempt to bring Iraq away from Iran, more into the pro-Western alliances. So I think that's something to keep an eye on as well. And it could be, that could be an attempt also to move into Syria to rehabilitate Syria in the Arab world and to make it an Arab issue again and not an Iranian one. So there are signs that some good things can be happening there as well.
Okay, there's a couple of Jordan questions. One relates to the Jordan's behavior, something you've alluded to. Jordan's behavior in terms of the Temple Mount, the whole Temple Mount controversy, and the seemingly the sort of unhelpful, to say the least, part that King Abdullah played in that whole episode. And another question here is, how can Jordan be made more welcome into the Abraham Accords, or that sort of that collection of the countries that met at the Negev Summit? Sure.
Let's start with the second one. It's easier. I think Jordan is entirely welcome. The foreign minister, Safadi, was invited. He didn't come. I think Israel would love to have them there, and the other countries would as well. They didn't want to come. They're welcome whenever. And, at the next Negev, it won't be the Negev, it'll be some other country, but they would be certainly welcome with open arms. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Jordan, a little background. So Jordan's ruling family, the Hashemites, their legitimacy is kind of rooted in their protection of Al-Aqsa, the Temple Mount, Jerusalem. They were used to be defenders of Mecca and Medina, and this is all they have left. Their legitimacy has always been somewhat under question in the kingdom. Their allies traditionally have been what's called the East Bankers, so the tribes, and not the Palestinians. Abdullah himself is also suspect. His Arabic isn't perfect. He married a Palestinian. His attempts to modernize the economy has seen him surround himself with Palestinian entrepreneurs and at the expense of the tribes who just kind of wanted government handouts in that tradition. That's this whole drama with Prince Hamza has been a response to that. As Hamza is seen as the son of the favored wife, and more legitimate in many ways than Abdullah. So I think it really does, when Jordan is seen as unable to defend the Temple Mount, is seen as being pushed out, rightly or wrongly, that really does get to them, and they want to make sure that they are showing that they defended. They, in all their statements, they say that they are the custodians of the Muslim and Christian holy sites in Jerusalem. If anyone knows Jerusalem, that would mean that they would be custodians of, next to the Knesset, you have the Valley of the Monastery of the Cross. They think that they're the custodians of that. It's ridiculous. Israel, if you can read the agreement between Israel, there's no mention of custodianship, nothing. It says Israel recognizes, I believe it's the special status or historical status, something like that, some term, that's it. So they always say custodianship. Israel never does. A lot of journalists use the word custodianship. They shouldn't. Biden used the word custodianship, and Pence actually did in 2018. So they really see themselves as Jerusalem as central to their being, and with all the discomfort that Abdullah feels around him and his legitimacy, I think that it's especially resonant. Also, let's think about the Abraham Accords. Like I said, it leaves them behind. It makes them feel, I think, somewhat useless. What's their role here now? Everyone else is celebrating something that they're barely a part of. So they have yet to come to terms that this is here to stay, and they've yet to find what their role is in the region. Certainly, you see, after what I've said, you can understand their interest in keeping these tensions in the news, right? And making statements about it and trying to, there was a meeting, I believe it was in Egypt, with Abraham Accords countries, and they're trying to get the Abraham Accords countries to say more harsh things, and Abraham Accords countries and Egypt declined to, they did criticize Israel, but they don't say what Jordan wants. So Jordan has to give their own little message after. So I think they were unhelpful. It's a dangerous game that Jordan's playing. It could really blow up in their faces. And I think we have to be aware of it. And, some of the criticisms that the Netanyahu folks said about Jordan back when they were in power, I think it comes true. And I think we're a little bit overly optimistic about this, return to this rapprochement, or whatever you call it, this golden age of relations with Jordan. It seems to be not as strong as we expected, and it seems to be real structural problems, and most of them coming from the Jordanian side.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So there's a couple of questions here relating to the Palestinians. So the first is from Negev Berman, and it's a very simple question, which is, the Palestinians have been totally absent from this discussion. Can you comment why this is so?
I assume the discussion between you and me.
Yes, I think that's what he means. Although perhaps also from the wider discussion, which is why it's been absent from this discussion. But you can answer that.
Right. So just personally, I don't cover the Palestinians closely. We have a Palestinian affairs correspondent. I've never pretended to be an expert on the Palestinians, but obviously it's relevant in anything that happens with Israeli diplomacy. Yeah. Turkey is going to continue. Turkey has decided that it will criticize Israel on the Palestinian front, but it can still do business and other things with Israel. I think African countries are very much the same way. Many of them are Muslim majority, and they feel a particular kinship to the Palestinians, and they are still going to disagree with Israel in international institutions, but that doesn't have to get in the way of these partnerships and doing business with Israel. And I think that also rings true for the Abraham Accords countries. The Palestinian issue is still resonant. I think less so with the UAE. It really has not been a central part of their education, and so I think that is certainly true. But the Palestinians and Turkey, that relationship is not 100% either. When there was tensions between the Saudis and Turkey, the Palestinians sided with the Saudis. So there are waves in that relationship as well. In terms of the bigger question of the Palestinians, I think no one expects there's going to be any major breakthrough anytime soon. But that doesn't. The big shift here is that the Palestinian issue, for all the myriad reasons that it's caught up and it's not moving forward, does not have to stand in the way of mutually beneficial partnerships for the region, for the countries. So I think that's the thing. We're not going to let the Palestinian disagreements on the Palestinian issue get in the way of people making money and fighting Iran and making lives better, hopefully, for people.
Just a quick follow-up on that regarding the Abraham Accords and the Palestinians. Has there been any change at all, even at the level of rhetoric? Because I'm thinking that when the Abraham Accords were signed, you had Donald Trump in the White House and Benjamin Netanyahu in the Prime Minister's office. And now you have a much more, so let's say, friendly to the Palestinians US administration, and an Israeli government which has, at least in the government, if not in the Prime Minister's office, centre-left representatives. Has that affected the conversation or the way that the discussions in the amongst the Abraham Accords countries, the way they're talking?
I really don't think so. And there's always the specter of Netanyahu kind of hanging out, in the wings. And I think, especially the Biden administration doesn't want to shake up this coalition over the Palestinian issue and break it apart and then have Netanyahu again. So I think that's helpful for the coalition, and I think it does Bennett a favor because he doesn't want to have to start navigating this. I think everyone understands, what the reality is here. That there's not a solution in the offing. They certainly don't want to see any annexations of the type that came about, before the Abraham Accords. But without, trying to keep violence in Jerusalem down, I think is in everyone's interest. We haven't talked about Gaza, and I think what's even more striking is no one talks about Gaza, right? After a year ago, after the operation, Guardian of the Walls, there was all these talk about these new arrangements. Egypt was involved, other countries were involved. Yeah, it seems to be certainly not a permanent solution, but not even a near-term fix. It's just kind of limping through, and people aren't even talking about it. So I think that is certainly even more striking, the silence over Gaza.
Yeah, so actually there's a question here from Robin Gottlieb, which relates partly to Gaza. She says, how strong are ISIS and Al-Qaeda still in Israel's neighbors, including in Gaza? So I guess that also includes Syria, of course.
Yeah, Sinai is the most relevant ISIS threat. Gaza, it's not the issue. The issue is Hamas and Islamic Jihad. Syria, no, I mean, ISIS really never posed a threat to Israel from Syria. It indirectly by posing a threat to Jordan, it could have undermined. But the Syrian regime is there to stay, and the big danger there is what that means about Iran's presence. I don't think the Russians want an Iranian presence on Israel's border either. Russia wants to see a stable Syrian government, so they have a stable ally in the Middle East. Gives them a foothold in the Middle East. It gives them bases in the Middle East, and they don't need to see Iran coming to shake that up and getting Israel involved. So I think the issue in Syria is Iran. The issue in Gaza is Hamas, and then ISIS is certainly a problem across parts of Africa and Sinai, but it does not seem to be the major issue like it was a half decade ago.
Right. Okay. All right. I think we have time for one last question. This is from Sheldon Lerman. He asks, can you comment on relations between Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states on one hand and Iran? Is there a risk of them drawing closer to Iran?
I don't think it's a risk. I think it's happening. We've seen talks in Iraq between Saudi officials and Iranians. We've seen talks between the UAE and Iranians. Part of that is a response to the Biden administration coming into power, both discomfort over expected pressure over human rights, but also the understanding that the U.S. is shifting away from the region. But I don't want to put all the blame on Biden because there was disappointment over Trump as well. Trump showed that he is willing to strike the Iranians when Americans were killed. But after major incidents like the Aramco attacks, he didn't kill any Iranians or do what they would have liked. So I think that they understood that they could either fight Iran, which they don't necessarily have the capacity to do, and that would get in the way of their economic transformation away from fossil fuels. So the other way is to talk to Iran. But the question there is, what are they talking about? Are they talking about Syria? Great. If they're talking about a way for the Saudis and Iraqis and Jordanians to have a stronger presence in Syria, that's not a bad thing. Are they talking about Lebanon? That could be a good thing, right? If the Saudis are willing to recommit to Lebanon and to be more involved with the Sunnis there, that could be a stabilizing force. So I think there are some good things that could happen from it. But again, it's really so hard to understand what the Iranians are trying to do. And we did not talk about the Vienna talks, the lack of Vienna talks. It's just unclear to me, at this point still, whether Raisi wants and the Supreme Leader want to make a deal. Like they're saying now that the problem was not the IRGC, the problem was the economic sanctions. So it's hard to see whether these are just excuses or whether there is what is holding it up, because before it was the IRGC designation that seemed to be holding it up. So the question is what the Iranians want. And then, they certainly don't want anything that's good for us. But the question is whether circumstances and economic pressures and the like will force them to change their behavior, but they haven't to this point. So I'm not optimistic about that.
Okay. We didn't necessarily end on a positive note, but I guess we did end on a sort of note of sort of watch this space, which I guess is the way it tends to be in the Middle East. Impossible to predict from one day to the next. But you've taken us on a great sort of tour of the various diplomatic arenas for Israel. So thank you very much, Lazar Berman, for joining us and for enlightening us and informing us. Everyone can read Lazar in the Times of Israel, and including the column that he said will be out a bit later on this evening or in a few hours' time. I've just written my email address into the chat. If you're not on my mailing list, then drop me an email paulg@begincentre.org.il, so you can get information about the English events that we have here at the centre, both in person and on Zoom. And I will see you next Wednesday. And once again, thank you, Lazar Berman, for your time. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Bye.
Thank you.